What would you do if your HOA suddenly banned all pets, without warning, without discussion, forcing you to choose between your home and your beloved companion? That's exactly what happened to me. Imagine waking up to a notice on your door. Your HOA has banned all pets, no exceptions. No warning, no discussion, just a cold, impersonal letter demanding that every pet owner comply or face fines, legal action, or even eviction. Now, for some, this might be frustrating, maybe even unfair. But for me, it was something far worse because my cat wasn't just a pet. She was a licensed therapy animal, crucial to my well-being. I had the paperwork, the legal protection, and every right to keep her. But the HOA didn't care. They refused to listen, dismissed my appeals, and doubled down on their threats. That's when I realized I had no choice but to fight back. What started as a ridiculous policy quickly spiraled into a legal battle, exposing corruption, abuse of power, and one major flaw in their plan: they never expected me to know my rights. I had lived in this neighborhood for years, and up until that point, things had been relatively peaceful. The HOA was strict, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. The usual complaints about lawn lengths, mailbox colors, and the occasional overstepped boundary were just part of the deal when you lived in a community like this. But everything changed when a new HOA president took over, a man named Richard Caldwell. He was the type of person who thrived on control, the kind who didn't just enforce rules, but actively looked for ways to tighten his grip on the neighborhood. Under his leadership, policies became harsher, fines more frequent, and the HOA's presence impossible to ignore. At first, it was small things: new parking restrictions, limitations on exterior decorations, and a crackdown on unsightly backyard furniture. People grumbled, but most complied. No one wanted to get on Caldwell's bad side. But then, the letter came. A community-wide notice slipped into every mailbox, written in cold, bureaucratic language. Effective immediately, all pets are to be removed from the community within 30 days. No exceptions. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and legal action. I read the notice 3 times, thinking I must have misunderstood. Surely they weren't serious. Banning all pets? What kind of rule was that? I immediately checked the HOA's official website, only to find a newly posted amendment, signed off by the board, justifying the change. It claimed that pets were a nuisance, that complaints about noise, allergies, and unsanitary conditions had led to this decision. I knew that was ridiculous. There had never been an issue. And even if there had been, this was an extreme response. But for me, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was personal. My cat, Luna, wasn't just a pet. She was a licensed therapy animal prescribed to help with my anxiety and PTSD. She had been with me for years, providing comfort in ways nothing else could. The idea of losing her over some arbitrary, power-hungry decision wasn't just infuriating. It was terrifying. I wasn't the only one outraged. Neighbors began talking, whispering about how absurd the rule was. Some were confused, others furious. A few even suggested it had nothing to do with pets at all, that it was just another way for Caldwell to exert his authority. But despite the growing unease, most people seemed too afraid to push back. They had seen what happened when homeowners went against the HOA: fines, legal threats, and in some cases, foreclosures. The message was clear: resistance was costly. But I couldn't just sit back and accept this. I had every legal right to keep Luna. Therapy animals weren't pets in the eyes of the law. They were protected under the Fair Housing Act, which specifically prevented housing authorities from discriminating against individuals with support animals. Caldwell either didn't know that or he didn't care. The first thing I did was try the polite approach. I attended the next HOA meeting, letter in hand, ready to explain my situation. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this was a misunderstanding, that if I calmly explained Luna's status, they would make an exception. I was wrong. The moment I brought up my therapy animal, Caldwell barely let me finish before dismissing me entirely. "We're not making exceptions," he said flatly, not even looking up from his papers. "The rule applies to everyone. If we start allowing exceptions, it defeats the purpose of the policy." I pushed back, mentioning the Fair Housing Act, but Caldwell smirked. "You're welcome to get a lawyer if you think you have a case," he said, as if daring me to try. "But the HOA has every right to set community standards. This isn't a public space, it's a private association." That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules, this was about control. He wasn't interested in fairness, legality, or even the well-being of the residents. He wanted obedience, and I wasn't about to give it to him. As I left the meeting, heart pounding, I knew this was only the beginning. If Caldwell wanted a fight, he was going to get one. The next few weeks were nothing short of a war. Caldwell and his HOA enforcers were wasted no time making my life miserable. It started with warning letters, printed official-looking notices stamped with HOA insignia, citing vague violations, and urging me to comply immediately. First, they claimed my lawn was overgrown, despite the fact that I mowed it weekly. Then, I was accused of leaving my trash cans out too long, even though I brought them in the same evening as pickup. Each infraction came with a fine, small at first, but steadily increasing with each so-called offense. At first, I thought it was just me. Maybe Caldwell had a personal grudge against me for challenging him in that meeting. But as I spoke to more neighbors, I realized I wasn't alone. Others were receiving similar letters, especially those who had voiced their objections to the pet ban. One elderly couple was fined for their porch light being too bright. Another homeowner was written up for having a small garden gnome in their front yard. The pattern was clear. Anyone who questioned the HOA's authority was being targeted. Despite the pressure, I refused to back down. I filed a formal complaint with the board, outlining the legal protections therapy animals had under federal law. I cited the Fair Housing Act, attached documentation from my doctor, and even referenced multiple court cases where HOAs had lost similar battles. I delivered the packet to the HOA office, expecting at least a response. A week later, I got one. Instead of a reconsideration, I received a final warning. The letter was colder this time, more aggressive. It stated that I had repeatedly violated community guidelines, ignored previous warnings, and was now facing serious consequences. The fines had stacked up, over 2,000 by their count. If I didn't pay, they would place a lien on my home, a tactic HOAs used to force compliance or push homeowners into foreclosure. This wasn't just a power trip anymore. It was financial warfare. I tried to reason with Caldwell one last time, catching him after an HOA meeting. I calmly asked why he was doing this, why he was ignoring the law and singling me out. He smirked, that same smug expression that he had in the first meeting, and said, "Rules are rules. If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." That's when I knew there would be no compromise, no reasoning, no appeal that would change his mind. He wasn't enforcing rules, he was making examples of people, and I was his favorite target. But what Caldwell didn't realize was that I wasn't going to roll over and take it. If he wanted to use the law as a weapon, I'd show him just how sharp it could be. I contacted a lawyer the very next day. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in HOA abuse cases. After reviewing my case, she didn't just see a lawsuit, she saw a goldmine. The HOA had violated multiple federal laws, including the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Their fines, their harassment, even the threats of foreclosure, everything was a blatant overreach. And worse, there was a paper trail. I had saved every letter, every notice, every email. My neighbors, also frustrated and scared, began handing over their own documentation. It wasn't just me anymore. It was half the neighborhood. Caldwell thought he could bully us into submission. What he didn't realize was that he had just started a rebellion. The moment I handed over my case to my attorney, things took a dramatic turn. She didn't just see a few violations. She saw an entire web of corruption. Caldwell and his HOA weren't just targeting me, they had a long history of questionable enforcement tactics, financial mismanagement, and worst of all, outright illegal actions. Digging through the HOA's publicly available records, my attorney uncovered something damning. The HOA had been imposing fines and collecting money from homeowners for years, but there was no clear accounting of where those funds had gone. Financial statements were vague at best, completely absent at worst. Legally, an HOA is supposed to allocate fines and dues or for community maintenance, but in this case, the money seemed to disappear into a black hole. Caldwell and his board had been writing themselves administrative bonuses, essentially paying themselves with community money under the guise of HOA duties. Then came the real bombshell. My attorney filed a records request and uncovered emails between Caldwell and a handful of board members. The emails explicitly discussed using fines as a tool to push out homeowners they saw as problematic. They referred to certain residents, myself included, as troublemakers who needed to be made examples of. Worse, one email outright admitted that the pet ban was a strategy to clean up the community, specifically targeting homeowners who had companion or therapy animals. That was it. That was the smoking gun. Armed with these documents, we had more than just a case against the HOA. We had a case for fraud, discrimination, and malicious enforcement. But I wasn't going to just sit back and let the legal system work slowly. No, I was going to hit Caldwell exactly where it hurt, his power. I gathered the affected homeowners and held a private meeting. Nearly 24 people showed up, each with their own horror story about fines, harassment, and threats from the HOA. Some were afraid of speaking out, worried about retaliation. But when I laid out the evidence, emails, financial discrepancies, records of abuse, the fear turned into anger. The next step was public exposure. If Caldwell thought he could operate in the shadows, he was about to learn the hard way that the spotlight burns. I reached out to a local investigative journalist, someone known for exposing corruption in city politics. It didn't take much to get his attention. One look at the evidence, and he was ready to run the story. Within a week, the news broke. The HOA's corruption, its illegal pet ban, and its financial mismanagement were plastered across local media. Homeowners in surrounding neighborhoods started coming forward with their own complaints. And suddenly, this wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern of HOA abuse across the entire district. Caldwell, once so smug and untouchable, now found himself at the center of a public scandal. But the real battle was only beginning. Because while the news was embarrassing for him, what came next would be far worse. He was about to face real legal consequences. The moment the lawsuit was officially filed, the entire neighborhood felt the shift. It was no longer just a battle between me and the HOA. It had evolved into a full-scale war for justice. The local media latched onto the story, plastering Caldwell's face across the news with headlines exposing the HOA's corruption, financial mismanagement, and illegal enforcement tactics. Residents from other communities, some who had suffered under similarly abusive HOAs, started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories. The pressure was mounting. Inside the courtroom, the stakes couldn't have been higher. My attorney presented the evidence with precision, outlining a clear pattern of misconduct. Unauthorized fines, unaccounted funds, fraudulent enforcement of regulations, and, most damning of all, the discriminatory practices that targeted specific homeowners. Every email, every document, and every manipulated rule was laid out for the judge to see. Caldwell sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his usual arrogance replaced by a visible unease. The HOA's attorney tried to downplay everything, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the fines were legally issued and that no discrimination had taken place. But the evidence was overwhelming. The emails alone dismantled their defense, revealing their calculated efforts to push out homeowners they deemed undesirable. The judge's expression remained neutral, but there were moments, especially when those incriminating emails were read aloud, where even he seemed taken aback by the audacity of the HOA's actions. Then came the testimonies. One by one, residents stepped forward, detailing years of harassment, threats, and fines that appeared out of nowhere. Some spoke of being pressured to sell their homes, while others recalled being ignored or outright silenced whenever they questioned the board's decisions. A retired veteran described how he was fined repeatedly for minor infractions, while newer, more preferred homeowners were allowed to break the same rules without consequence. Each testimony painted a darker picture of the HOA's corruption, solidifying what we already knew. This wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate abuse of power. As the trial progressed, Caldwell's composure began to crack. When questioned directly about the missing HOA funds, he stuttered through vague answers, unable to provide any concrete explanation. The records showed massive discrepancies, Thousands of dollars collected in fines and fees with no trace of where the money had gone. It was a blatant case of embezzlement, and it became clear that Caldwell had been treating HOA funds as his personal bank account. Then came the final blow. My attorney called in a former board member, someone who had resigned in protest years ago. He testified that Caldwell had been manipulating HOA elections, ensuring only his loyalists could serve on the board, keeping himself in power indefinitely. That revelation shattered whatever credibility Caldwell had left. By the time closing arguments were made, the outcome was all but decided. The HOA had been exposed, the community had rallied, and Caldwell was backed into a corner with no way out. The question now wasn't whether we would win, but just how severe the consequences would be. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the final verdict. The ruling was decisive. Caldwell and his inner circle were found guilty of financial mismanagement, discriminatory enforcement of HOA regulations, and election fraud. The judge didn't hold back, ordering the immediate dissolution of the current HOA board and mandating an external audit of all funds collected over the past 5 years. Fines were to be refunded, and homeowners who had been unfairly penalized were entitled to compensation. But the biggest blow? Caldwell was personally held accountable for misappropriated funds, facing legal charges that could result in heavy financial penalties, or worse, jail time. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once felt powerless against the HOA's tyranny now celebrated in the streets. Homeowners who had been forced to sell their properties due to excessive fines were contacted, given the chance to reclaim what had been unfairly taken from them. The media, which had been following the case closely, reported the ruling as a landmark victory, not just for our neighborhood, but for homeowners everywhere who had suffered under corrupt HOAs. But while the legal battle was over, the real work had just begun. A new HOA board needed to be elected, one that was transparent, fair, and dedicated to serving the community rather than exploiting it. I, along with several other residents, took the lead in restructuring the organization, ensuring safeguards were put in place to prevent another Caldwell from ever rising to power again. New policies were implemented. Financial records had to be publicly accessible. Major decisions required a community vote, and no single person could serve indefinitely. As the neighborhood began to heal, I reflected on everything that had happened. What started as a personal battle over an unjust fine had evolved into something much bigger, a fight for accountability, fairness, and the right to live in a community free from corruption. It wasn't just about one victory in court. It was about setting a precedent that would hopefully inspire other homeowners facing similar struggles to stand up and fight back. Looking around, I saw the change firsthand. Homeowners who had once been at each other's throats over arbitrary rules now worked together to rebuild trust. The sense of paranoia that had settled over the community for years was lifting, replaced by a renewed spirit of unity. This was how an HOA was supposed to function, not as a dictatorship, but as a collective effort where every voice mattered. As for Caldwell, his downfall was swift. Disgraced and legally cornered, he resigned from all community roles and disappeared, leaving behind a legacy of deceit and abuse. But in the end, his departure was a footnote in a much larger story, one where justice prevailed and an entire community reclaimed its power. And so, the battle ended not with a quiet surrender, but with a resounding victory, one that proved once and for all that no HOA, no matter how ruthless, is above the law. John's story serves as a powerful testament to the strength of resilience and knowledge. It proves that no system, no matter how rigid or corrupt, is beyond accountability when challenged with facts and determination. What began as one man's fight against an unjust fine transformed into a community-wide movement that restored fairness and transparency. The lesson here is clear. Never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right. Sometimes all it takes is one determined individual to spark change, turning the tide against injustice and setting a precedent that empowers others to reclaim their rights and dignity. If you found this story compelling and believe in standing up against injustice, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest deep dives. Have you ever faced an unfair HOA or a power-hungry board? Share your experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story.